So you think you've dealt with HOA nightmares? Try having one try to evict you from your own family hunting lodge, claiming it violated their rules, only to discover that the land they built their little empire on? Yeah, that actually belonged to me the entire time. If you're settling in, maybe grab some popcorn, because this particular brand of bureaucratic overreach blew up in their faces in a way that still makes me smile whenever I drive past their meticulously manicured entrance sign, which sits squarely, hilariously, on my property. It started, as these things often do, with a piece of certified mail. I was up at the lodge, a rustic A-frame my grandfather built back in the 50s, deep in the woods of Appalachia. It's my sanctuary, miles from anything resembling a subdivision, accessible only by a winding, occasionally treacherous gravel road. No neighbors for miles, just towering oaks, the rushing sound of Laurel Creek nearby, and the kind of profound silence that settles deep in your bones. I'd just finished splitting wood for the evening fire when I noticed the letter carrier's Jeep bouncing its way up the drive, an unusual sight. He handed me the envelope with a quizzical look. Summit Ridge Estates Homeowners Association? He read aloud, squinting. Didn't know they reached out this far. Neither did I. Inside, typed on heavy bond paper adorned with a pretentious leafy logo, was a formal notice. It stated, in the kind of legalese only petty tyrants truly love, that my unapproved structure, the lodge that had stood there for 70 years, was in violation of Summit Ridge Estates covenants. Section 4. Subsection B. Exterior Aesthetics and Maintenance. Apparently, my wood stain wasn't an approved color. My lack of ornamental shrubbery was unacceptable. And the detached woodshed was an unauthorized outbuilding. It demanded immediate remediation within 30 days, along with a stern warning about unpaid HOA dues currently accruing penalties. I laughed. It had to be a mistake, some crossed wire at the county records office sending their boilerplate nonsense to the wrong address. Summit Ridge Estates was that new development over the ridge, the one with the faux stone gates and rows of identical beige houses crammed onto tiny lots, easily 5 miles away as the crow flies, and a good 20-minute drive by road. We shared a mountain shore, but we were in different worlds. I figured I'd call them, clear it up, and that would be that. Oh, how beautifully naive I was. Little did I know, I was about to meet Brenda. The phone number on the letterhead connected me to an automated system that felt overly sophisticated for a mountain community HOA. After navigating a labyrinth of options, press 3 for Architectural Review Committee inquiries, I was put on hold, subjected to tinny classical music that screeched periodically. Finally, a sharp clipped voice answered, Summit Ridge Estates. Brenda speaking, Board President. I explained the situation calmly, assuming a simple error. Hi Brenda, my name is Marcus Smith. I received a violation notice regarding my property, but I think there's been a mix-up. My place isn't actually part of Summit Ridge. There was a pause, thick with skeptical silence. What's the address again? She asked, her tone implying I was probably lying or profoundly stupid. I gave her the address, the one assigned by the county decades ago for emergency services, clearly marking the location deep in the unincorporated forest land. I heard the clacking of keyboard keys. Ah yes, she said, a note of smug satisfaction entering her voice. The lodge. Well, Mr. Smith, according to our official plat maps, your parcel falls within the designated boundaries of the Summit Ridge Estates Overlay District. Overlay District? That was a new one. I'd inherited this land free and clear. The deeds were ironclad, passed down through 3 generations. There was no mention anywhere of an overlay district or any encumbrance by a nascent HOA built decades after my grandfather hammered the first nail. I'm sorry, Brenda, I said, trying to keep the exasperation out of my voice. But that simply can't be right. My family has owned this land since the 1940s, long before Summit Ridge was even conceived. The lodge was built in the 50s. It's completely separate. Her reply was dripping with condescension. Well, perhaps your records are out of date. Our developer worked closely with the county when establishing the estates. All properties within the boundary are subject to the covenants and restrictions. It's for the good of the community, ensuring property values, and maintaining a certain standard. The implication was clear. My 70-year-old, perfectly sound, beautifully rustic lodge didn't meet her standard. She then launched into a lecture about the specific violations. The heritage brown stain wasn't on their approved palette, which seemed to consist solely of various shades of beige and taupe. The stacked firewood was untidy, and the very existence of the woodshed was an affront. I tried to interject, to explain the geographical absurdity, the sheer physical distance, the separate access road, but she talked right over me. You have 30 days to submit plans for remediation to the Architectural Review Committee, she continued breezily, and you'll need to settle your outstanding dues. They currently stand at $800, plus late fees and the initial violation assessment charge. I was stunned. $800? For what, air? She finished with, failure to comply will result in further fines, and ultimately, we will be forced to pursue lien placement and foreclosure proceedings. Have a wonderful day. And she hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, loud in the sudden silence of the cabin. Foreclosure? On my family's land? Over the color of wood stain? The absurdity washed away, replaced by a cold knot of anger. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. This Brenda, this self-appointed guardian of beige, had somehow convinced herself, or been convinced by faulty paperwork, that she had dominion over my ancestral home. The peace of the forest suddenly felt charged, violated. The fight, it seemed, had just found its way up my gravel road. I looked out the window, across the porch where my grandfather taught me to identify constellations, towards the ancient woods he'd cherished. There was no way in hell I was letting some power-tripping HOA president from a cookie-cutter development miles away take this from me. Brenda had picked the wrong fight. She just didn't know how wrong yet. I needed to understand how this colossal error or deliberate overreach could have possibly happened. My first stop would have to be the county courthouse, bright and early Monday morning. I needed maps, deeds, records, the paper trail that would hopefully make this ridiculous claim disappear. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being forced to defend my secluded, off-grid sanctuary using the very bureaucratic tools of the civilization I sought refuge from. But if Brenda wanted a war of paperwork, I'd give her one she wouldn't forget. The lodge wasn't just wood and stone. It was memory, legacy, and a piece of my soul. And I wasn't about to let her pave over it with her taupe-colored tyranny. Monday morning found me at the county recorder's office, a place smelling faintly of old paper and Windex. I explained my situation to a kindly clerk named Martha, a woman who seemed to have worked there since the ink was still wet on the Declaration of Independence. She listened patiently, adjusting her bifocals as I recounted Brenda's claims of an overlay district. Martha frowned. Summit Ridge Estates. Yeah, the new development up past Miller's Gap. But an overlay district extending out to the old Hemlock Creek area, where your lodge is? That doesn't sound right, honey. She pulled out the huge fabric-bound index books, her fingers tracing lines across archaic entries. Then she moved to the computerized system, her brow furrowed in concentration. After 20 minutes of searching, she turned back to me, shaking her head. I can't find hide nor hair of any overlay district encompassing your property, Mr. Smith. The original Summit Ridge plat maps, filed back in 2008 when the developer bought the acreage from old Mr. Henderson's estate, show clear boundaries. Your parcel, she pointed to a specific number on my deed record, is definitively outside that subdivision. Miles outside. She printed out the official county plat map for Summit Ridge, highlighting its borders in yellow. Then she pulled up the tax map showing my parcel, outlined in blue. There was a vast, green-shaded area separating the two, an area labeled simply Forestland Tract 7. My lodge sat squarely within that tract. So what could they be basing their claim on? I asked, feeling a surge of vindication mixed with confusion. Beats me, Martha shrugged. Maybe the developer gave them some internal map that was wrong? Or maybe, she lowered her voice slightly, This Brenda character is just ambitious. We get folks trying to stretch boundaries sometimes. She made copies of my original deed, the Summit Ridge plat map, and the relevant tax map section, stamping them all with the official county seal. This should be enough to show them they've made a mistake, she said reassuringly. Armed with official documents, I felt confident. I drove back towards the mountains, stopping to mail a certified letter to Brenda and the Summit Ridge HOA board. Return receipt requested. The letter politely but firmly stated that my property was not, and had never been, part of Summit Ridge Estates, enclosed copies of the official county maps and my deed reference, and requested they immediately cease all communication, retract the violation notice, and confirm in writing that the matter was closed. I figured that would be the end of it. Logic and evidence were on my side. Surely, faced with incontrovertible proof from the county itself, Brenda would back down. The return receipt came back signed a few days later. Then, silence. For about 2 weeks, blissful, unbroken silence, I started to relax, thinking the official documents had done their job. Then came the second letter. This one wasn't polite. It arrived via courier, marked, "Final Notice." Pending legal action. It dismissed my documentation as irrelevant and potentially fraudulent. It claimed the HOA possessed superseding documents provided by the original developer, confirmed their jurisdiction via the overlay district, though curiously, copies of these supposed documents were not included. The letter reiterated the demand for immediate remediation of the lodge, payment of all accrued dues and fines, now totaling over $1,200, plus newly added legal consultation fees. The deadline was reduced to 10 days. If I failed to comply, the HOA would commence eviction proceedings and file a lawsuit to recover all costs. It was signed not just by Brenda, board president, but also by 2 other board members. This wasn't just Brenda anymore. The board was backing her play. The tone was aggressive, threatening, and utterly dismissive of the official county records. My anger returned, sharp and hot. Irrelevant? Fraudulent? They were calling the county recorder's certified documents fraudulent? This had moved beyond simple bureaucratic incompetence into the realm of delusion or deliberate intimidation. I called my college buddy, Dave, who now practiced real estate law in the city. I explained the situation, the absurdity of the claims, the official maps, and the HOA's outright dismissal of them. Dave listened, occasionally whistling low. "Wow," he said finally. "That's ballsy. Claiming county records are fraudulent? Brenda sounds like a real piece of work. An overlay district that isn't on county maps. That smells fishy as hell. It sounds like they might be relying on some internal developer paperwork that was never properly recorded or is legally meaningless." He paused. "Okay, here's the thing. They can claim anything they want, doesn't make it true. But if they're threatening lawsuits and eviction, you need to take it seriously, even if it's baseless. We need to figure out what superseding documents they think they have, or if they're just bluffing." Dave advised me not to communicate further with the HOA directly. "Let me handle it from here. Send me copies of everything you have, your deed, the letters, the maps Martha gave you." He also suggested I discreetly install some security cameras around the lodge. If Brenda's this aggressive on paper, he warned, she might be tempted to escalate things on the ground. Trespassing inspections, vandalism. It happens. Better safe than sorry. The thought of Brenda or her minions creeping around my property made my skin crawl. That evening, I ordered a set of motion-activated trail cams online. Installing them felt like a violation in itself, turning my sanctuary into a monitored zone. But Dave was right. Brenda's belligerence suggested she wouldn't stop at nasty letters. The battle lines were drawn, and the quiet woods were about to become a contested territory. This HOA wasn't just mistaken. They were actively hostile, ignoring official proof and doubling down on a claim that seemed geographically and legally impossible. What were they hiding? What developer documents could possibly grant them authority over land they clearly didn't own according to the county? The investigation was just beginning, and the stakes felt higher than ever. It wasn't just about paint colors anymore. It was about defending my home and heritage from an aggressive takeover based on What? A fantasy? A lie? I intended to find out. The trail cams went up the next weekend, tucked discreetly overlooking the driveway, the lodge perimeter, and the woodshed Brenda seemed so offended by. For a week, nothing happened. The 10-day deadline in the HOA's letter came and went. I half expected a sheriff's deputy to show up with an eviction notice, but the woods remained quiet, save for the usual deer and the occasional brazen raccoon investigating the trash cans. Then, one crisp afternoon, my phone pinged. Motion detected on camera 2, overlooking the main approach to the lodge. I pulled up the feed. A mud-splattered SUV, definitely not one I recognized, was parked just off my gravel drive. Partially hidden behind a cluster of rhododendrons, 2 figures emerged. One was instantly recognizable from the scowling picture on the Summit Ridge Estates website's Meet the Board page: Brenda. She was wearing practical hiking boots but paired them incongruously with crisp linen slacks and a blazer, looking utterly out of place, like a city pigeon trying to blend in with wood thrushes. With her was a burly man I didn't know, carrying a clipboard and a camera. They proceeded to walk directly onto my property, ignoring the clearly posted "Private Property No Trespassing" signs I'd installed after Dave's warning. Brenda pointed emphatically at the lodge, then at the woodshed, while the man took photos and made notes. They circled the entire cabin, peering into windows, testing the porch railing. At one point, Brenda physically chipped a piece of paint off the window trim with her fingernail, presumably to compare it against some internal Holy Grail beige color chart she carried in her mind. They spent a good 15 minutes conducting their unauthorized inspection before climbing back into the SUV and driving off towards the direction of Summit Ridge. I saved the video footage immediately, my blood boiling. This wasn't just aggressive, it was blatant trespass. They knew damn well I had challenged their authority and provided proof I wasn't part of their precious HOA, yet here they were, sneaking onto my land like common prowlers. I immediately forwarded the footage to Dave. His reply was swift. "Got it. Clear trespass. Keep those cameras rolling." This is exactly the kind of behavior that blows up in their faces later. A few days later, another certified letter arrived. Not from the HOA's board this time, but from a law firm I'd never heard of, representing Summit Ridge Estates. It was a formal notice of intent to file suit, citing the unresolved covenant violations, the unpaid dues, now inflated further with more legal fees, and, hilariously, failure to permit authorized inspection. Attached was a bill for the inspection itself, $200 for site assessment services. They were billing me for their trespass. The letter gave me a final 14 days to comply with all demands or face a lawsuit seeking foreclosure, damages, and court costs. "Okay," Dave said when I called him, reading him the letter verbatim. "They've lawyered up. That means they're either incredibly stupid or they genuinely believe they have a case based on whatever documents they think they possess. It's time we stopped reacting and went on the offensive." He began the deep dive. While the county recorder's office showed the surface level, the final plat maps, and my deed, Dave wanted to go deeper, tracing the entire history of the land. He hired a title researcher specializing in complex rural deeds to examine the chain of title for my property and the land purchased by the Summit Ridge developer. We needed to know exactly what was bought and sold, and under what conditions, going back as far as possible. Weeks turned into a slow grind of waiting for reports, deciphering century-old deeds written in elegant cursive and cross-referencing obscure county filings. Dave spent hours on the phone with the title researcher, piecing together the history. My grandfather had purchased the large forest tract, over 3,000 acres, in the late 1940s from a defunct logging company. He built the lodge in the early 50s. He lived there year-round until his health declined in the 80s, after which it became our family's seasonal getaway. Crucially, he never subdivided or sold off any part of it. When he passed, the entire tract transferred to my father, and then to me. The Summit Ridge developer, a faceless corporation called Mountain View Homes LLC, had purchased about 500 acres adjacent to my family's land in 2007 from the Henderson estate. As Martha had mentioned, this was the land where they built the Summit Ridge Estate subdivision. The key question remained: how did the HOA convince themselves they had jurisdiction over my separate, pre-existing property? The breakthrough came from the title researcher, who unearthed the original purchase agreement between Mountain View Homes LLC and the Henderson Estate Executor, along with the preliminary development plans filed with the County Planning Commission, documents predating the final, officially recorded plat map. And there it was, buried in the appendices of the initial development proposal, a concept map, crudely drawn compared to the final survey. This early map showed the proposed Summit Ridge development plus an adjacent area labeled Potential Future Expansion Zone Environmental Buffer. This buffer zone sketchily included the area where my lodge stood. It appeared the developer had hoped to acquire or control this surrounding forest land, perhaps envisioning hiking trails, or just ensuring no other development occurred nearby. However, the final, legally binding purchase agreement and the recorded plat maps clearly showed Mountain View Homes LLC only ever purchased the 500-acre Henderson parcel. They never acquired, leased, or gained any rights whatsoever over my family's 3,000-acre forest tract. So, what I think happened, Dave explained, his voice tinged with the excitement of discovery, is that the developer likely handed over a pile of documents to the newly formed HOA board, including these preliminary, aspirational maps. Brenda and her crew, either through incompetence or wishful thinking, latched onto that potential expansion zone map and treated it as gospel, ignoring the actual, recorded property lines. They built their entire claim on a developer's fantasy that never materialized. The superseding documents they bragged about were likely nothing more than unrecorded, non-binding preliminary sketches. Their overlay district was a fiction based on a dashed hope. And the best part? Dave added, practically laughing. That forest land tract 7, the massive green area on the county map that separates you from Summit Ridge, the one your lodge sits in, that's not just some random woods, pal. According to the deed records, going back to the 40s, your grandfather bought all of it. You don't just own the land your lodge sits on. You own the entire 3,000-acre forest surrounding Summit Ridge Estates. My breath caught. 3,000 acres? I knew my family owned a lot of land, but the sheer scale hadn't quite registered. The development, Dave continued, is basically an island completely surrounded by your property. The only access road they use to get in and out of Summit Ridge Estates, that long paved road cutting through the woods from the main highway? According to the deeds and easements, that road cuts directly across your land. My mind raced. Brenda wasn't just trespassing on my lodge property. Her entire HOA, every resident driving in and out, was technically traversing my private land every single day. This changed everything. This wasn't just about defending my lodge anymore. It was about realizing I held all the cards. The trespass video, the fraudulent claims, the harassment, it all clicked into place. Dave was already thinking ahead. We don't just have a defense, we have grounds for a massive counterclaim. Trespass, slander of title, harassment, maybe even punitive damages for this blatant disregard of property rights. Brenda wanted a fight? She's about to get one she could never have imagined. The thought was intoxicating. The quiet refuge Brenda had tried to claim, the sanctuary she deemed substandard, was actually the seat of power. She thought she was the queen of her little beige castle, when she was really just a tenant on my mountain. The revelation that I owned the entire forest surrounding Summit Ridge Estates, including their access road, was a game changer. Dave and I spent the next week strategizing. Our initial defensive posture shifted dramatically towards an offensive one. The HOA's lawsuit threat was no longer intimidating. It was an opportunity. They file suit. They open themselves up to discovery and our counterclaims. Dave explained gleefully. It's the perfect scenario. They walk right into the trap. He began drafting a comprehensive response and counterclaim package. It meticulously detailed the history of the land ownership, included certified copies of every relevant deed and map dating back 70 years, highlighted the discrepancy between the developer's preliminary sketches and the legally recorded documents, and attached time-stamped copies of the trailcam footage showing Brenda's trespass. The counterclaim section was robust, alleging repeated trespass, harassment, slander of title by falsely claiming jurisdiction and filing notices, attempted extortion through baseless fines and fees, and potentially intentional infliction of emotional distress, given their persistent and aggressive tactics despite being presented with contrary evidence. We calculated damages, not just for Dave's legal fees, but for the installation of the security system necessitated by their actions, the time I'd lost dealing with their nonsense, and punitive damages meant to punish their egregious behavior and deter future misconduct. Dave also researched the structure of the HOA itself, its incorporation documents, its bylaws, the names of all current board members. Brenda might be the mouthpiece, he noted, but the entire board signed off on that second threatening letter. They're all potentially liable. We discussed the access road issue. According to the original easements filed when the main highway was built decades ago, my family granted the county right-of-way for public passage along the highway itself. However, the side road leading from the highway, through my forest, and into what was now Summit Ridge Estates, no such public easement existed in the records. It seemed the developer had simply paved an old logging trail across my family's land, without securing a formal, permanent easement from us. It was possible they had some informal agreement with the Henderson estate before they sold, or more likely, they just assumed nobody would notice or care. For years, apparently, they were right. Until now. Legally, Dave mused, you could potentially gate that road. Or, at the very least, demand a formal easement agreement, which would likely involve a hefty payment and ongoing maintenance contributions from the HOA. They've been using your private road for free all this time. The thought of installing a gate at the entrance to Summit Ridge, requiring Brenda and her beige brigade to get my permission to come and go, was incredibly tempting, a truly delicious form of poetic justice. However, Dave advised a more strategic approach initially. Let's keep the road issue as leverage for now. Hit them with the main counterclaim regarding the lodge first. Once they realize they have absolutely no jurisdiction and are facing serious damages for harassment and trespass, they'll be much more amenable to negotiating things like road access. The preparation phase felt like assembling an elaborate legal siege engine. We gathered affidavits, prepared exhibits, and fine-tuned the legal arguments. I even found an old photo album containing pictures of my grandfather building the lodge, clearly dating its existence, long before Summit Ridge was a glimmer in a developer's eye. More evidence countering their unauthorized structure nonsense. As we worked, I couldn't help but picture Brenda's face when she finally understood the reality of the situation. Her smug confidence, her dismissive tone, her utter certainty in her non-existent authority, it was all built on sand. The foundation of her little fiefdom was about to crumble, and I had the geological survey proving it. We decided not to wait for them to file suit. The HOA's 14-day deadline from their lawyer's letter was approaching. Dave recommended we preemptively file our response and counterclaims in county court just before their deadline expired. It shows we're not intimidated, and it frames the narrative from the start. He argued, we're not just defendants, we're the aggrieved party seeking justice. He also drafted a separate, sharply worded cease and desist letter addressed to the HOA's lawyer, Brenda, and the entire board. It outlined the core facts, highlighted the ownership of the surrounding forest and the access road, demanded an immediate cessation of all contact and harassment, demanded retraction of all violation notices and fees, and attached proof of the trespass. It put them on formal notice regarding our impending legal action if they didn't comply fully and immediately. This might make their lawyer pause and actually look at the documents before blindly filing suit. Dave hoped a smart lawyer would see the massive liability here and advise the HOA to fold immediately. But judging by Brenda's previous behavior, neither logic nor caution seemed to be her strong suit. I pictured her receiving the letter, her face likely turning puce, perhaps grabbing her blazer as if preparing for battle, utterly convinced of her righteousness. The stage was set. All our documents were finalized, cross-referenced, and ready for filing. The cease and desist letter was ready to be sent via courier, ensuring receipt. The counterclaims were poised. All that remained was to light the fuse and wait for the inevitable explosion from Summit Ridge. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing that the very rules and legal systems Brenda had tried to weaponize against me were now arrayed against her, backed by the undeniable truth of 70 years of land ownership. The trap was laid, baited with facts, and the clear evidence of their own misconduct. Now, we just had to wait for Brenda and her HOA to step into it. The quiet patience of the forest seemed to seep into me, a deep, steady confidence replacing the initial anger and frustration. They had mistaken my sanctuary for their territory. Soon, they would learn the true boundaries of their world. Dave filed our comprehensive response and counterclaims with the county court clerk on a Thursday morning, precisely one day before the HOA's lawyer's deadline expired. Simultaneously, a courier delivered our detailed cease and desist package, complete with maps, deed excerpts, and stills from the trespass video, directly to the HOA's management office, Brenda's home address, listed in their incorporation filings, and the office of their attorney. The package landed like a grenade, timed for maximum impact before they could launch their own ill-conceived legal assault. We anticipated a swift, possibly panicked reaction. What we got initially was nothing. Silence. Friday came and went with no lawsuit filed by the HOA. Monday, Tuesday, still nothing. No angry phone calls, no sputtering emails, no further threatening letters. It was eerily quiet. Two possibilities, Dave theorized. Either their lawyer took one look at our package, realized the monumental screw-up, and is now desperately trying to talk Brenda and the board off the ledge, or, he paused, they're completely ignoring it, doubling down on stupid, and preparing some even more ludicrous response. Given Brenda's track record, Dave leaned towards the latter, but hoped for the former. The suspense was palpable. We had revealed our hand, the full extent of my land ownership, the access road issue, the trespass evidence, the counterclaims. We had effectively shown them they were naked in a legal blizzard, holding nothing but a worthless map sketch. What would they do? Retreat in disgrace? Or charge forward into oblivion? The answer arrived about 10 days later, not through lawyers, but via the community grapevine. A neighbor down the main highway, closer to the Summit Ridge entrance, the entrance on my land, I now constantly reminded myself, called me. Heard there was some big drama up at the HOA meeting last night, she said. Something about the board being sued, and somebody claiming they own the whole forest? Apparently, our court filing and cease and desist letter had landed just before a scheduled HOA board meeting. The news had likely sent shockwaves through their little echo chamber. According to my neighbor's account, pieced together from panicked chatter she'd overheard at the local grocery store, the meeting devolved into chaos. Brenda, initially attempting to dismiss our claims as intimidation tactics, was apparently shouted down by other homeowners who had somehow gotten wind of the situation and were terrified about the potential legal costs and the implications of the access road discovery. Someone had allegedly produced copies of the county plat maps we'd originally sent, contrasting them sharply with whatever developer map Brenda kept waving around. Accusations flew, blame was shifted, and Brenda's usual autocratic control reportedly evaporated under the weight of the facts and the fear of massive financial liability. The HOA's lawyer, caught completely off guard by the counterclaim's scope and evidence, suggesting he hadn't been properly reviewing the case or advising caution, was supposedly backpedaling furiously. He had apparently advised the board, after receiving our package, to immediately halt all actions against me and seek a settlement. Brenda, however, had reportedly resisted, still insisting on the validity of her overlay district. This internal conflict was paralyzing them. While the board floundered, Dave advised we proceed as if our lawsuit was moving forward. We formally served Brenda and the other named board members with the lawsuit paper. The confrontation we had prepared for, the big courtroom showdown, seemed like it might dissolve into internal HOA chaos instead, but Brenda wasn't done yet. A few days after the disastrous meeting, she took matters into her own hands, seemingly without board approval or legal counsel. I received a final piece of certified mail. It wasn't from the HOA officially, but personally from Brenda, though written on what looked like HOA letterhead she'd commandeered. It was a rambling, semi-coherent diatribe. It accused me of using strong-arm tactics and falsified documents to steal land that rightfully belonged to the community. It reiterated the violations regarding my lodge, painted me as a hostile outsider threatening their peaceful neighborhood, and, bizarrely, demanded I immediately grant the HOA a permanent, free easement for the access road as a show of good faith. It concluded with a barely veiled threat. People around here protect what's theirs. You should remember that. Dave was livid. This is witness tampering and intimidation? Sending this after we filed suit? She's digging her own grave. He immediately filed a copy of Brenda's letter with the court as further evidence supporting our harassment claims. He also contacted the HOA's lawyer, forwarding Brenda's letter and stating that her unauthorized communication constituted harassment and potentially violated legal ethics, demanding the lawyer control his client. The lawyer responded almost immediately, sounding mortified. He assured Dave he had not authorized or even known about Brenda's letter and that he had advised the board, and Brenda specifically, against any further contact with me. He practically begged for a settlement conference. It was clear Brenda had gone rogue, blinded by her crumbling authority. The HOA board, terrified of the escalating legal fees and potential personal liability outlined in our counterclaim, finally seemed to wrestle control away from her. We heard through the grapevine again that an emergency board meeting was held, resulting in Brenda being stripped of her presidency and likely facing removal from the board altogether, though the details were murky. The stage was set, not for a courtroom battle, but for a settlement negotiation where the HOA held absolutely zero leverage. They knew we had them cornered on the trespass, the harassment, the baseless claims, and the crucial ownership of the forest and their only access road. The showdown wasn't going to be a dramatic reveal in front of stunned homeowners as I had initially pictured. Instead, it was a slow, satisfying implosion of Brenda's reign, triggered by the irrefutable facts we'd meticulously assembled. They had started a war over paint colors and shrubbery, and now they faced losing access to their homes and paying significant damages for their arrogance. The next step was the settlement table, where we wouldn't just be seeking retractions and apologies, but tangible compensation for the trouble they'd caused, and firm agreements solidifying my rights and their boundaries permanently. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the defendant fighting off a nuisance. I was the landowner dictating terms to the tenants, who didn't even realize they were renting access until it was almost too late. The settlement conference took place not in a stuffy courtroom, but in Dave's considerably more comfortable office conference room. Representing the Summit Ridge Estates HOA were their sheepish-looking lawyer and 2 board members, neither of whom was Brenda. She had apparently been forcefully sidelined, though officially she had resigned from the board, citing personal reasons just days before the meeting. Good riddance. The atmosphere was starkly different from the arrogant correspondence I'd received for months. The 2 board members, a middle-aged man named Gary and a woman named Susan, looked profoundly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact initially. Their lawyer, a man named Peterson who seemed eager to put this entire debacle behind him, started by offering a formal apology on behalf of the HOA for the misunderstanding regarding jurisdiction and the overzealous enforcement actions. Misunderstanding, overzealous. Cute euphemisms for blatant incompetence, trespass, and harassment. Dave let the apology hang in the air for a moment before cutting to the chase. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. Mr. Smith provided certified county documents proving his property was outside your jurisdiction early on. Your board, under Ms. Weston's leadership, chose to ignore those facts, dismiss them as fraudulent, engage in trespass, which we have on video, and pursue escalating threats, including baseless legal action. This wasn't overzealousness. It was actionable harassment and slander of title. He laid out our demands, which were non-negotiable. First, a complete and formal retraction of all violation notices, fines, fees, and threats related to my property, submitted in writing and notarized. Second, a public statement issued to all Summit Ridge homeowners, clarifying that my property and the surrounding forest land were not part of the HOA, and acknowledging the error in jurisdiction, phrased carefully to avoid further legal issues for them, but clear enough to vindicate me. Third, full reimbursement for all my legal fees and related costs, including the security system installation. Dave presented the itemized bill. Fourth, significant damages paid directly to me for the harassment, trespass, and slander of title. Dave proposed a figure that made Gary and Susan visibly blanch. Peterson, the lawyer, countered immediately, arguing the damages were excessive. Dave just smiled thinly. That brings us to point 5, he said smoothly. The access road. He produced the large-scale survey map showing the winding road from the highway to the Summit Ridge entrance, cutting directly and significantly across my forest land tract 7. As you know, or should have known had proper due diligence been done initially, this access road is entirely on my client's private property. There is no recorded public easement. Your residents, delivery trucks, service vehicles, everyone has been accessing the development via private land without a formal agreement. Peterson's face tightened. Gary and Susan exchanged panicked looks. They clearly understood the implication. My client, Dave continued, has been extraordinarily patient regarding the unauthorized use of his land. He could, quite legally, install a gate tomorrow and restrict access until a formal easement is negotiated. Given the history between him and the HOA, such negotiations would likely be protracted and costly for Summit Ridge. However, he paused for effect. My client is prepared to consider granting a formal, non-exclusive access easement under certain conditions, provided the other settlement terms, including the damage amount as stated, are met in full. It was a masterful checkmate. Agree to our terms, including the hefty damages, and secure legal access to your homes. Fight us, and risk being literally cut off, facing an even costlier lawsuit you're guaranteed to lose, plus still needing to negotiate road access from a position of absolute weakness. Gary cleared his throat. What are the conditions for the easement? He asked tentatively. Simple, Dave replied. The HOA assumes full financial responsibility for the maintenance, repair, and snow removal for the entire length of the access road, from the highway to your entrance sign. Currently, my client bears the cost indirectly through property taxes on land you use. That ends. You will also adhere to strict speed limits. Install signage indicating it's private property with granted access, and carry sufficient liability insurance, naming my client as an additional insured party. Peterson looked at his clients. Susan nodded almost imperceptibly. Gary sighed, rubbing his temples. And the damage payment? Peterson asked, circling back to the sticking point. Pays for the easement, Dave said simply. Consider it the price for securing permanent legal access after years of unauthorized use, and compensation for the trouble your HOA caused Mr. Smith. It's a package deal. All terms met, or no deal, no easement, and we proceed with the full force of the lawsuit. There was a long silence. Peterson conferred quietly with Gary and Susan. After a few tense minutes, he turned back to us. Okay, he said, looking defeated. We agree to the terms. All of them. The relief in the room from their side was palpable, replaced by the grim reality of explaining the settlement, particularly the financial hit and the road maintenance liability, to their residents. Dave drafted the settlement agreement on the spot. It included every point: the retractions, the public statement, the full reimbursement of my costs, the agreed-upon damage payment, which was substantial enough to feel like true vindication, the granting of the road easement with all stipulated conditions, and mutual releases from further claims regarding this specific matter. Everyone signed. As Gary and Susan filed out, looking shell-shocked, Dave turned to me with a grin. Well, he said, I think that went rather well. It was an understatement. We had not only defended my lodge, but secured compensation, established permanent boundaries, and turned their primary vulnerability, the road, into a point of leverage that sealed the deal. The following weeks saw the settlement terms executed flawlessly. The funds appeared in my account. A formal, notarized letter of retraction arrived, along with copies of the somewhat humbled statement distributed to Summit Ridge residents. Driving past their entrance now feels different. The faux stone pillars and the manicured sign still sit there, but now I know they sit there because I allow it, on my terms, maintained at their expense. Brenda Weston has reportedly moved away, whether due to shame or simply being persona non grata in the community she tried to rule. I don't know or care. The lodge feels peaceful again, perhaps even more so than before. The fight forced me to understand the true history and extent of my family's land, in a way I never had before. Standing on the porch now, looking out over the endless expanse of trees, knowing unequivocally that this is mine, free from the meddling of petty tyrants in beige houses, brings a profound sense of peace and satisfaction. It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest bullies just have the least information, and standing your ground, armed with the facts, can lead to the sweetest kind of justice. So, if you find yourself dealing with an unreasonable HOA or any bully drunk on a tiny bit of power, remember this story. Dig deep, know your rights, find your leverage, and don't be afraid to push back. Sometimes, the little hunting lodge owner actually owns the whole damn forest. Drop a comment if you've ever had a run-in that felt this outrageous solidarity, right?